Hello everybody, good to see you again. Well, obviously I can't see you, but you can see me. But I'm imagining that I'm just sitting across from you and talking to you. I wanted to talk some today about myths and also mythic stereotypes and other ways that we tell ourselves stories about what we can and can't do. And I'd like to start with the picture that's this week on the weekly assignments, and it is of my maternal grandmother, who we knew as Nanny, and grandfather, who we called Papa, was Nanny and Papa, their son Irving, and a woman, I have no idea who she is. And I share this with you because this is one of the mythic stories that echoes through my life, just like all of us have stories of the people before us that come through our lives, and they definitely leave their imprint. Nanny, her real name was Molly, came to this country when she was 9 years old from Poland. Her mother had been killed in one of the pogroms. She was the youngest of many sisters and brothers. She was an orphan, and as it worked out, her siblings who were around were unable to take her in. And her oldest sister was in America, in Brooklyn, the old country version of the new country. So she came to live with her and make a new life. She definitely was a stranger in a strange land, and she found her way, though. She eventually married my grandfather, Dave Prusak. His real name was Abraham. I have no idea why he went by Dave. And they had a son, Irving, who was the love of her life. Unfortunately, when Irving was 5 years old, he died in her arms, most likely of a bacterial infection. This was in the days long before antibiotics were widely available. And she went on to have 2 daughters, including her youngest daughter, my mother. As the years went by, she found out that all of her siblings, and it was a pretty big family in Poland, died in the Holocaust. And you can imagine with the history that she had been through that she was very traumatized, so maybe it was no surprise that she was in those days diagnosed as manic depressive. I believe she would be labeled bipolar now. I share this story, or at least one small sliver of this story with you, because her story of loss of family, of the literal land where she lived, of her country, obviously of part of her sanity, is part of the legacy that echoed through my family. And stories like this in families are constantly and inadvertently passed down, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. So what do we do with these materials? When I moved to the Midwest and started my first vegetable garden, I really bonded with Nanny over the potato plants. I told her that I was growing potatoes. She was thrilled and asked me if they had white or yellow flowers, or purple flowers, like the ones she grew in Poland. And it showed me just how different her life was than how her life turned out, living in a high-rise apartment, bunches of apartments in a low-income section of Brooklyn, so far from her home, in a whole other language, in a whole other culture. But part of her legacy isn't just all the pain and suffering, it's that she did start this new life. She had children, her children had children, and so on and so on, all of whom did not, thank God, have to go through the type of loss and trauma that she has. Yet, no surprise, a lot of us struggle with anxiety and depression. I know this is a common story for many, many families. What's passed down can sometimes, in some ways, play out in some of what we work with today. But her story is also one of resilience. Resilience, especially for her, was very, very much expressed in humor. She would constantly chase me around the house pretending to be a 600-pound gorilla. She would pose like Jesus on the cross in the living room when my father walked through to just kind of freak him out and catch him by surprise. She could be really mean-spirited, but she was certainly funny. And she also was known for her cooking, how she took care of her grandkids, and how she kept going despite all this despair as she made this new life, and as she definitely taught my family that we need to look at mental health as well as family health. Her story also speaks to us of both history and mythology, which I talk about this week in some of the writing up there, that what happens historically to us is often translated into the myths, the stories that we come from, that we live through. For my grandmother, the myth of America as the golden land where you could start a new life was very, very real. And coming here literally saved her life. Her story is just one of many, many stories that I work with and live with in my life. And we all have so many stories. I think of the myths that we carry very much as kind of concentric circles. At the very center circle, here we are, and here's the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. I'm not the kind of woman who would ever fill in the blanks. When actually, as time goes on, we find we don't always know the kind of person we are. Around the stories we tell ourselves, we have our closest friends, family, sometimes family of origin. The people in that inner circle change over our lives. And we can easily be seen in a certain way and see others in a certain way, whether it's true or not. You might be the rainbow sheep in your family, for example. Around there we have our community stories. You might be seen as the fix-it person in your workplace or the total screw-up in your community. You might see others in this kind of shorthand too. And around that circle we have the big circle of cultural stories, of what you're supposed to do and not do, what you can do for a living and what you can't do, how you love, who you are, how you believe you are to live. And working with these stories, looking at what historical forces, what personal story forces play through them and play through us and into us, is invaluable in freeing ourselves up to live the story we feel most chosen to live, to follow our callings and see where they lead to us. The story I told you of Molly Prusak, aka Nanny, is also a story that's just one angle of her that was refracted to me through my experiences and through what other relatives said about her. There's always so much more. There's a whole other Molly Prusak I never recognized or never got a chance to meet. Just like all the stories that tell us who we are, that influence what we see as our materials, that show us what we can and can't do, or how we can and can't do them, are just slivers of what's actually there. We are so much more complex than can be expressed in a single story. And by the way, there's a great TED video called The Danger of a Single Narrative, or something like that. Going back to these materials, these mythic stereotypes, these stories that echo through us, we see most of all that they're fluid. The stories that we know, that we use to support our lives, that support us, that infuse our sense of identity, are just just cups of water gathered out of the river of stories running by. What I invite you to do is to return to the river, to the larger sources that sustain you. Your personal stories, your family and closest friend stories, your community and cultural stories, and sitting on those river banks watching the running water, always in motion, always changing, See what you can see. I end this talk with a poem that I wrote that goes back not to my grandmother, but actually to what I imagine as my great-grandmother, her husband's mother, in Lithuania, as a way to reimagine some of the stories that may have a lot to do with what I'm doing, who I am, and what I'm discovering these days. It's called Crossing Over. At the edge of the yard, somewhere in Lithuania, she takes it all in, the white bark of the forest, the dark vertical shadows, the tall field between here and horizon. Wind rises from the banks of trees and rushes everywhere, reminding her to lift her chest, inhale sharply, remember. Who will come after her, and then what? Will the grasses part in the same way in tomorrow's weather? The leaves sing their breaking song, the air hold the weight of the world evenly around each being. Is she the first or the last to hear the ending world? From years ahead, I wait for her to turn to the future. When she does, her face catches the late light and she sees me, sitting cross-legged on a wooden floor in Kansas. What is there to say from here to there that would help? A cow walks through a parking lot, a peacock screams, all of us far from oceans, wars, the urgency of living in a world on the cusp of vanishing. My great-grandmother doesn't know she will die in this very spot, facing away from soldiers and fires. How most of the village will face the guns or gas chambers quickly or slowly, in the camps or holes in the ground, little places to think the last best thought. The air she exhales falls off the earth like the sun tonight and every night. Her surviving children will spread like water on hard ground that softens over time, so far from her view at the end of the yard. All she knows is the cleansing light of the wind, the moment the world balances before her, the way love can shelter itself as a dark bird, not so hidden in the birches, ready to exhale from the leaves that keep remaking themselves, and the breath from her body that will one day be my body. Thanks so much.